This is a short talk about the axilla, known colloquially as the armpit or the underarm, a fairly innocuous part of the body, but one which contains quite important structures that we need to know something about. So here's a really common scenario. A young man comes to the emergency department with what appears to be an abscess in his armpit, and we think we're going to drainage. Usually in this situation, do we really ever consider the anatomical structures within this area that may be damaged? So the importance of this talk is just to introduce us to the anatomy of the axilla and some of the important structures that pass through it. So the axilla is a shallow fossa which lies between the humerus laterally, the chest wall medially, and the anterior chest wall and posterior chest wall muscles anteriorly and posteriorly. The apex of the axilla is the head of the humerus. Its anterior wall is formed by pectoralis major. Its posterior wall is formed by a series of muscles of the upper back, including subscapularis, teres major, and latissimus dorsi. The medial wall is the chest wall, which at this point is covered by serratus anterior. There are some important neurovascular structures that pass through the axilla, including the axillary artery and vein, and the brachial plexus and its branches. And of course, there are some important lymph nodes which drain the upper limb, the anterior chest wall, the upper back, and most importantly, the breast. So let's look at these structures in a bit more detail. The axillary artery is formed as the continuation of the subclavian artery as it passes under the clavicle, between the clavicle and the first rib. It then passes down and laterally through the axilla, and on its way out of the axilla continues as the brachial artery, which runs between the flexor and extensor compartments of the arm, that is between biceps brachii and the triceps muscle. In its course through the axilla, the artery gives off several branches which supply the muscles of the pectoral girdle. Also of great importance, it is in very close association with the brachial plexus. Brachial plexus passes just lateral to the axillary artery, below the clavicle and above the first rib, and then it splits up and rejoins into its cords which surround the axillary artery in the axilla. The lateral, medial and posterior cords are really named as the relationship of the cords to the axillary artery itself. As the nerves pass out of the axilla, they form their main branches, such as the musculocutaneous nerve from the lateral cord, the ulnar nerve from the median cord, the median nerve, which derives its origins from both the medial and the lateral cord, and then from the posterior cord, the extensor nerves, which include the radial nerve and the axillary nerve. Accompanying the brachial and axillary arteries are the deep veins in the axilla. The basilic vein accompanies the brachial artery down the medial aspect of the arm. It is joined by the brachial vein at the base of the axilla. The brachial vein drains the deep structures of the arm. And then higher up in the axilla, near its apex, the cephalic vein joins what is now the axillary vein, and the cephalic vein drains the lateral aspect of the arm. So these are the important neurovascular structures that pass through the axilla. The other thing we need to consider are lymph nodes. So here's another really common scenario. A middle-aged female with a hard lump in her axilla, which we think might be a lymph node. Of course, in this circumstance, we need to think about what has caused this lymph node to enlarge, and of course we're going to be thinking about a metastatic tumor. In this circumstance, the most likely cause is a breast carcinoma, and indeed the primary drainage of the breast is to the axillary lymphatic plexus. So the breast tissue drains superficially to the axillary nodes, and these are divided into four main groups: the anterior or pectoral group, the posterior group, a central group, and a apical group. There are also some subclavicular nodes which are part of this grouping, but they're not really in the axilla. They are just outside the axilla, in the deltopectoral groove. On the right hand side, this gives us a little more information on drainage of the breast, and it emphasizes that while the superficial structures of the breast drain via the anterior or pectoral nodes into the deeper or central nodes of the axilla, and then into the deep subclavian nodes, the deep structures may drain directly into the parasternal nodes, which accompany the internal mammary artery. So that was a very brief look at the axilla. If you have any questions, you can bring them up in class. In summary, the axilla is an important area of the body which contains some very important neurovascular structures as well as lymph nodes, particularly those that drain the breast. I hope you found this talk useful, and thank you for listening.